Chapter 554 Questioning. What is it? Kingen looked at her unhappily. Please let her speak. One can't let her frame my mother for no reason. Yang Wanning looked at Mrs. Chui and said, Kingen is here, father is here, and many others are here too. You must make yourself clear today. What did my mother do to make you try to smear her name before your death? If you don't clarify, don't even think about dying painlessly. Wanning, come down. She's your mother. Yang Shiqing shouted. She's not worthy of being my mother. I want to acknowledge a person who wants to kill me, my brother, and even try to frame my mother before she dies. Yang Wanning shook her head. Don't spout nonsense. You didn't even ask her anything. How do you know if she's talking nonsense? Or maybe you know if she's telling the truth. You? The people below listened and immediately clamored to support Yang Wanning. All of a sudden, the voices of the people united. Their voices grew louder and louder until they reached a deafening level. When Kingen saw this, he immediately stood up. Taking advantage of the pause between their shouts, he roared, Stop! All of you! Stop! He approached Mrs. Chui and said, Mrs. Chui, I'm now asking you as a judge of the Ministry of Justice. Tell me what you mean by what you said earlier. Mrs. Chui didn't know what to say. She couldn't say she dreamed that Mrs. Gu wanted to kill her, right? Wouldn't that indirectly admit that she killed Mrs. Gu? She never expected Yang Wanting to dare to barge onto the execution platform. HJH before she could say anything. Yang Shiqing came up and said, Your Highness, she's just rambling before her death. Let's execute her. Otherwise, it will be getting late. Kingen looked at Yang Wanting after hearing that. From her words, Mrs. Chui may have more evidence of her crimes. In addition to Mrs. Gus' relationship with King An's mother, he planned to help Yang Wanting out. There's no hurry. Since she spoke out, one want to get to the end of this today. I can't let my mother be framed for a groundless crime. Yang Wanting looked at Yang Shiqing firmly. You? Yang Shiqing glared at her, trying to indicate that she shouldn't pursue the matter any further. He wanted Mrs. Chui to refrain from speaking again. It would get him killed if Mrs. Chui couldn't take the pressure and said something she shouldn't. However, Yang Wanting ignored his looks and looked at Mrs. Chui. Why? Cat got your tongue? Why aren't you saying anything? She had to clear up any misunderstandings today. Otherwise, it would be up to everyone's imagination once Mrs. Chui was executed. Yang Wanning and her brother would be in a bad position at that time. Yang Wanyu was also extremely anxious, but she dared not go up on stage because she knew what Yang Wanning said was true. She was afraid that she would get implicated. Yang Chengsun wanted to go up, but he was held down firmly by Yang Chenglin. Mrs. Zhao and Mrs. Ning were happy at this turn of events, but they had no intention of going upstage. Kingen said to an official on the right, Record it. He then gave the two soldiers beside him a look.
Yes.
The official replied and sat down at the table, preparing his stationery. The two soldiers also came forward and took Yang Shiqing to the side. They covered his mouth and guarded him. His struggles were useless. Mrs. Chui saw Yang Shiqing could no longer help and had no choice but to tell everyone about the night before the robbery in their residence and her dream of Mrs. Gu. However, she hid the fact that Mrs. Gu was coming to her for revenge. Yang Wanning asked quickly, So, you must have been frightened by my mother seeking her revenge? Chapter 555 Warning, There's no such thing. Mrs. Chui quickly denied this. However, the uneasiness in her eyes was clearly seen by Kingen. It seemed she may have caused Mrs. Gus' death. This meant he did not have to be polite any further. He looked at Yang Wanning and asked, Do you have any evidence? She did harm my mother, but one don't have conclusive evidence for her murder. But one have evidence of the person who harmed me. As for corrupting my brother heard it with his ears. I knew of this too. Yang Wanning said, Did you bring your evidence? No, I originally intended to let go of this since she's getting executed. Since she would be executed in such a disgraceful way, for my father's sake, I didn't want to pursue the matter. But since she wanted to drag my mother's name through the mud before her death, I can't tolerate this anymore. Yang Wanning wiped her tears and continued, All my evidence and witnesses are ready for presentation any time. Speak. One will send someone to get them. King quickly called a team of soldiers over. Young Wanting turned around and led a group of soldiers to the side. She told them the location of her evidence and witnesses in a low voice. After the soldiers heard this, they greeted King In and quickly galloped away on their horses. Mrs. Chui was panicking at this moment. She did not expect Young Wanting to have gathered witnesses and evidence of her crimes. When did she start collecting them, and how much did she collect? What should she do? Wanting, don't forget that your surname is Yang. Madame Chui warned Young Wanting. She didn't want to bother, but she spoke up when she considered Yang Shiqing's future. Of course, I know my surname is Yang. But no matter what, I can't just watch my mother's name get dragged through the mud. For example, if someone claimed you murdered my grandfather, do you think my father would not care? From the moment you forced me to ask King Rui for his betrothal gifts to subsidize Yang Wanyas, our relationship was over. Moreover, since we were young, you've never liked us siblings. Especially me. You never even gave me a piece of candy. You won't deny this, right? Madame Chui looked at Yang Wanting's cold gaze and could only turn her head away and ignore her. She then gave Mrs. Chui a look. When Mrs. Chui received her gaze, her heart turned cold. However, for the sake of her two children's future, she finally compromised. As long as she refused to admit it, no one could do anything to her. These exchanges did not escape Yang Wanting's eyes, but she ignored them. It didn't matter to her how many crimes she could convict the soon-to-be executed Mrs. Chui of, because she just wanted to leave the Yang family. Once word got out today, not many people would believe that Mrs. Chui was innocent. Sure enough, the crowd was in an uproar. They booed Mrs. and Madame Chui, and even Yang Shiqing. They knew it was impossible for him not to know about this happening in his household. Those who knew his background immediately spat in disdain. After all, he was a typical example of someone who relied on his in-laws to start his career. It was shameful for him to treat his first wife and two children like this. Of course, there was no shortage of gossip in the capital. In a short while, a ton of old gossip was dug up. Most of them were about stepmothers abusing stepsons, daughters bullying illegitimate children, etc. About 15 minutes later, the guards rushed over with Yang Wanting's evidence and witnesses. Of course, Gu Chungrui and King Rui, who had been informed in advance, also rushed over. King Rui did not approach the execution ground. Instead, he stopped in an alley a distance away. After the witnesses and evidence were brought up, Yang Wanting pointed at the scholar and explained loudly how Mrs. Chui and her daughter plotted against her marriage. Chapter 556. Not admitting. King An looked at the scholar and asked, "Is what Miss Yang told the truth?" The scholar pointed at a woman and said, "Yes, she is the one who came to me. She asked me to ruin Miss Yang's innocence and then marry her. However, before I could make a move, one was discovered by King Rui's convoy." Yang Wanting pointed at another woman and said, "This is Mrs. Yua's personal maid, Mrs. Shen. She's the one who sent someone to put hardy ice plant in my tea leaves." "Is it true?" King An looked at Mrs. Shen. Mrs. Shen looked at Ms. Chui and saw that she was staring at her. She knew she wasn't allowed to say anything, so she quickly lowered her head and pretended to be mute. King An shook his head when he saw this. He looked at the servant girl who did the dirty work and asked, "You are the one who put the hardy ice plant into her tea leaves?" "I did it, but I had no choice. Mrs. Shen captured my brother to threaten me." "It doesn't matter, as you're the one who did it. You could have told your missus in advance or stopped her from drinking it after that, but you didn't do it." King An shook his head. Next was the matter of Yang Chenglin getting corrupted. Yang Chenglin personally came up and told King An everything he had heard that day. Finally, he looked at Cheng Yangsen and said, "Humph, I've always treated you as my younger brother, but you treat me as your enemy. We're no longer brothers. You deserve it. Who asked you to be so stupid? You can't tell north from south after a few compliments. Tisk, are you even any different? Oh my God, wealthy people are sure spoiled. They can even purposefully nurture a spoiled brat. We smaller families can't afford to do this. Money is nothing. What they want is property and status. That is something that no amount of money can buy." Exactly. Besides, he was just a child. How much could he spend? These people just have to raise him until he is too spoiled and make Lord Young hate him. This would be enough to prevent him from inheriting the family property. Such a vicious stepmother, suppressing the two children with different methods. Most importantly, no one could say anything since she provided everything her stepson wanted. If this really succeeded, she would at most sigh and say that it was sure difficult for her to be a stepmother. She could push all the blame on her away cleanly. Scheming which, yeah, and this will get her a good reputation at the same time. Young Wanting was not in the mood to listen to the people's gossip, so she quickly asked Mrs. Sun to explain her situation. Mrs. Sun briefly explained what happened to Mears. Goo. Finally, she pointed at a beggar beside her and said, that night, the maid on duty was called Suea, but she disappeared the next morning. Her husband, Chiu Sheng, stopped us on our way here. Your Highness, that is indeed the case. When we were returning, this beggar named Chiu Sheng blocked our way. A soldier came up and bowed. Chiu Sheng kept shaking his head, but he couldn't make a sound. You're mute? Kingen asked thoughtfully. Chiu Sheng nodded. He crawled around the ground and found a stone. He started writing on the ground with difficulty. A total of 3 short sentences explained the matter clearly. In the first sentence, Suea was instructed by Mrs. Shun to cut off the charcoal. The second sentence explained that they were hunted down after being released from the residence. In the third sentence, it was revealed that he was poisoned to make him mute. After he finished writing, he pointed to his throat and started crying. Seeing this, Yang Chenglin stepped forward and wanted to kick him, but Gu Chengrue stopped him. Now was the time to fight against a common enemy. Chapter 557 Swear King and saw that all the evidence was focused on Mrs. Shun. He looked at Mrs. Shun and asked, Mrs. Shun, in the face of their accusations, do you admit it? Mrs. Shun nodded and looked like a pig waiting to be slaughtered. Who instructed you? No one. Madam is my savior, so I only wanted to protect her from harm. So, you want to take all the blame on yourself? Yang Wanting gritted her teeth. I did it alone. Mrs. Shin raised her head and swept her eyes over her indifferently. Yang Wanting was furious after hearing that. She thought Mrs. Shun would speak up after seeing that Mrs. Chui was on death row. She didn't expect Mrs. Shun to protect Mrs. Chui, even if it meant her death. The relationship between this master and servant was deep. Mrs. Shun was just a widow whom her in-laws chased out. Her maiden family had disappeared because of the disaster, so she had no one related. She did not have anyone who she could be threatened with. Yang Wanting could only look to Kingen for help. Kingen also had a headache. Looking at Mrs. Shun, he knew she was unafraid of death. Or rather, she did not care about life and death anymore. It was difficult to get such a person to speak. Yang Wanting saw the difficult position she was in and was at a loss. Gu Chengrue happened to notice the smug look in Mrs. Cuy's eyes. However, he couldn't do anything openly in public. At this moment, Zhou Ying's voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Ask her to swear to Mother God. The more deathly her oath, the better. Gu Chengrue was stunned by the suggestion. After he returned to his senses, he was thrilled. He had a strong backer, so there was no reason to be afraid of her not confessing. He looked at Mrs. Shen and spoke up. We'll put a rest to this if you swear to Mother God that if you are doing this to protect Mrs. Chui, you will be a slave for 10 generations. Swear that your descendants will be slaves for generations. Swear that your family will have no descendants. After hearing this, Mrs. Shun looked at him in shock because his suggestion was vicious. This would render her unable to turn over a new leaf forever. Yang Wanting nodded in agreement and said, Yes, everyone knows Mother God has manifested her spirit. One thinks she will have her opinion. If you swear, as my cousin said, I will believe you then. Everyone's expression changed immediately when they heard the word Mother God. Of course, most people were excited. They all wanted Mrs. Shun to take this oath. They wanted to see if Mother God would punish these villains or not. Gu Chengrue noticed that Mrs. Shun was staring intently at him. He glanced at her and said, Don't feel wronged. After all, there are lives on your hands. Since you have sinned, you should be prepared to pay your debts. Yes, swear, swear. As long as you swear, we will believe that Mrs. Chui is innocent. That's right. Hurry up and swear. We can see if Mother God will care about these things. Swear, swear, swear. Mrs. Shen looked at the chanting crowd below and did not know what to do. King crossed his arms and watched the show from the side. If this matter really succeeded, then it meant there would be a way to deal with even the most stubborn criminals in the future. Yang Wanning saw Mrs. Shen was finally panicking and pressed on. Make an oath. If you dare say it, they'll believe all of this is your doing alone. Mrs. Shen gritted her teeth and glanced at Mrs. Chui. Seeing her staring at her nervously, she finally closed her eyes and said, I, Mrs. Shen, swear that if I protect Chui Fengji, at this point, she couldn't continue. She was afraid that if Mother God really manifested, she would never have a good life. Just as everyone was about to urge her, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck down in front of Mrs. Chin, scaring her so much that she screamed and immediately fled backwards. Chapter 558. The end of the Chui family. The others weren't any better off either. They were all frightened. This was especially true for the guilty Mrs. Chui. Her originally pale face had turned green from shock. Just as everyone was still recovering from their shock, a Lu-foot-tall phantom of the Mother God appeared in the air and slowly said, Heaven has long arms. The good will be rewarded with good, while the evil with evil. After saying that, she gradually disappeared. King In, the first to regain his senses, immediately knelt and said, One bid your farewell, Mother God. With his words, everyone quickly returned to their senses and immediately knelt and kowtowed. Mrs. Shun, on the other hand, had a look of despair on her face. Remembering that she had not finished her oath, she heaved a sigh of relief and kowtowed 3 times to Mrs. Chui. She then kowtowed to young Wanning and said, I'm sorry, young miss, one was wrong. It was Mrs. Cui's instructions to poison Madam and you with the hardy ice plant, cut off Madam's charcoal, and find the scholar to frame you. As for the eldest young master, I only inquired about his whereabouts. I did not participate in anything else. At the same time, Yang Shirching almost peed his pants. He never expected Mother God to show herself. Did she know what he had done? Realizing what would happen to him, his legs went weak. Anything else? Yang Wanning looked at Mrs. Shun and asked. Without waiting for her to speak, Mrs. Zhao rushed up and questioned. Back then, when one miscarried, was it planned by you and your mistress? Mrs. Shun raised her head, looked at her guiltily, nodded, and replied, Yes, back then. Madam found a kind of mint that would attract cats and rubbed it all over your clothes. It really is you. I'm going to kill you. Mrs. Zhao quickly rushed toward Mrs. Chui. She didn't reach for her neck, but she still punched her stomach a few times until she fainted. Do you know where Mrs. Chui hardy ice plant comes from? Yang Wanning asked again. Mrs. Chen shook her head. I'm not sure. One only know that someone sent it over. One don't know anything else. Seeing this, King took the opportunity to interrogate Mrs. and Madam Chui again, but they refused to give any helpful information regarding Yang Shircheng. He made the two swear, but they ignored him, looking like pigs waiting for slaughter. When King saw this, he decided it was time for their execution. He was already certain that Yang Shircheng must have participated in the loan shark business. However, he also knew that the emperor had other plans, so he quickly ordered their execution to start. The executioner also hated the two of them very much, so he deliberately slowed down his actions, causing them to suffer greatly. But this time, no one jeered. Instead, everyone was reflecting on whether they had done anything wrong. It would be troublesome if Mother God remembered that. Ultimately, Mrs. Shun and that little servant girl were exiled together. As for the beggar, Qiu Sheng, he bit his tongue and committed suicide after witnessing Mrs. Cui's death. When Gu Chungrui saw this, he got someone to buy an ordinary coffin to bury him. After everything was over, the butler quickly arrived with the coffins and shrouds. When Yang Wanning and her brother saw this, they were ready to accompany Gu Chungrui out of there. Stop! Yang Shircheng shouted. We haven't collected your grandmother and mother's bodies yet. We will never admit Mrs. Chui as our mother. As for grandmother, I'm afraid she doesn't want to see us. It's better to let the person she likes collect her corpse. After Yang Wanning finished speaking, She pulled young Chenglin away and followed Gu Chengrui. Father, look at them. Young Wanyu wanted to sow discord between them, but she was frightened by young Shiqing's cold gaze. She could only bring young Chengsen and the officials to collect the bodies of the Chui family. Chapter 559 Deterrence. After leaving the execution ground, Gu Chengrui turned to look at the siblings and asked, "What are you guys thinking? Do you want to go home with me, or back to the Yang residence?" "Let Chenglin go home with you. I'm going back to the Yang residence. After so many things have happened, it's time to end it completely." Yang Wanning replied, "I don't want to. Let's shoulder it together." Yang Chenglin shook his head. "Be obedient. If anything happens, I won't be able to protect you at all. One don't need your protection. This is our problem, so we have to face it together." Yang Wanning wanted to say something, but Gu Chengrui interrupted her, saying, "Let him go. He's already a half-grown kid. It's time for him to make his decision. They'll send someone to protect you too in secret. All right, sorry for the trouble. No worries. Remember, you can resist, but don't take the initiative to stir up trouble." "I understand." Yang Wanning, her brother, and Mrs. Sun walked back together. When Gu Chengrui saw this, he turned around and looked for King Rui. "Your Highness, the Chui family have all been executed. I heard that Mother God appeared just now?" "Yes, she also left behind 2 sentences. Heaven has long arms. The good will be rewarded with good, while the evil with evil. Heaven has long arms. Good, good. One hope all the bad people in the world can be brought to justice. Yes, it's just a matter of time. You're optimistic. Let's go." "All right," Gu Chengrui replied and climbed into the carriage. After sitting down, he poured himself a cup of tea to warm his hands before briefly explaining what happened to Mrs. Chui. King Rui nodded after listening. "The rest is up to you. If you need manpower, remember to let me know." 2 hours later, the capital knew that Mother God had manifested. The saying that good and evil would be rewarded quickly spread. Even children who could not read could clearly repeat her words. However, those who had done something wrong began to tremble. They feared getting struck by lightning. When the emperor received the news, he laughed and said, "Good, good. With the intimidation of Mother God, some people should restrain themselves." He looked at Uniquely in a while. "Pass on my decree. Tomorrow, all the princes must go to the Mother God temple to offer incense and money. This servant will go and give the orders." After Uniquely finished speaking, he turned around and walked out. After he left, the emperor fell silent. He had done many bad things in the past few years and didn't know if Mother God would settle the score with him too. In short, many people had the same mentality, leading to the exceptionally exuberant incense offerings in the various Mother God temples. Gu Chengrui returned home and went to the study to find Zhou Ying, who was practicing calligraphy in her room. "Babe, thanks for the hard work. It's all right. They'll recover soon. Remember to send someone to the Yang residence to protect the siblings in case Yang Shiqing makes a move." "Don't worry. I've already borrowed 4 men from King Rui. If anything really happens, they will act in time." "That's good. By the way, shouldn't we recruit some men too? We shouldn't keep using other people's guards. We can't rush this. Everyone in the capital could be a spy, so we have to be careful about this. Lin Tian and the other 3 have already started vetting candidates." "Good. After Yang Wanning and her stuff are done, we'll head to the manor to stay there for some time." Chapter 560. A mockery. Why? Are you bored? Yeah, there's nothing to do. There aren't many people I can talk to in the capital. It's quite boring. All right, they'll bring them along for a short retreat. We'll come back after Yang Shiqing's problems are over. After the two had dinner, Zhou Ying began to spread out her divine senses to look at Yang Wanning and her brother. Noticing that they were eating dinner, she went to Yang Shiqing and the others. They had already collected all the corpses, stored them in the mortuary, and planned to bury them tomorrow. Although there weren't many people on the streets, Zhou Ying noticed everyone was gossiping about the Yang family. In particular, they were discussing Yang Shiqing. Some said that he persuaded Mrs. Chui to kill Mrs. Gu. Some even said he had a part in the plot against Yang Wanning and her brother, and that his goal was to take over the entirety of Mrs. Gus' dowry. However, there were also some who thought he was a fool and had been schemed against by his mother and wife. No matter what, he was in a disadvantageous position. The majority labeled him ungrateful and ruthless, while the rest questioned his ability. If he couldn't even know how to manage his family, how could he be an official in the government? Yang Shiqing and his party turned around a corner and bumped into a drunkard. After the drunkard recognized Yang Shiqing, he immediately mocked him. Minister of Revenue? What a fool. If you can't even see the people around you clearly, why don't you go home and tend the farms instead? What do you know? Get up, get up. The butler pushed the drunkard away. I don't know anything, but you should. Could it be you really did conspire with Mrs. Chui to commit murder? You're looking for death. Yang Chengsen rushed over and punched him. The drunkard fell to the ground, but he still managed to kick Yang Chengsen. You must be the son of Mrs. Chui, ruthless as she is. Come, come, hit my head if you date. You. Yang Chengsen was so angry that he was trembling. He grabbed a stone from the roadside and wanted to throw it at the drunkard's head. Although Yang Shiqing wanted to kill this drunkard himself, he knew that his family could not afford to stir up any more trouble. He immediately grabbed Yang Chengsen's arm and said, "Stop! Why are you bickering with a drunkard?" After saying that, he quickly dragged him forward. When the others saw this, they immediately chased after him. The drunkard pointed at their backs and shouted indignantly, "Who's a drunkard? I've never been drunk in my life." After saying that, he staggered away. After returning to the manor, Mrs. Ning saw that the manor was dark and barely anyone was walking around the courtyard. She quickly asked the butler to investigate what was going on. However, Yang Shiqing was not in the mood to deal with this. He returned to the house to wash up, ate a bite, and went back to sleep. After Mrs. Ning returned to her room, she saw her daughter eating obediently at the table. She walked over and said, "Ruer, you naughty girl. Why didn't you wait for Mom to come back for dinner?" "No, Mom. Nanny brought the food here, so I couldn't hold back." "Mistress, the food was sent by young Mississippi. She said she didn't know when you all would be back, so we should let the Ruer eat first." Mrs. Ning was surprised by that. She remembered how Yang Wanning had avenged Mrs. Gu today and wondered if she was trying to rope them in. After all, Yang Wanyu and Yang Chengsen were more favored by Yang Shiqing. After what happened today, they had to rope in more people to stand by their side if they still wanted to gain a foothold in the residence. Ruer was the only child in the residence other than the two pairs of siblings. Did the young miss say anything else? It isn't appropriate if someone comes later and you, the eldest grandson, aren't here. Yang Shiqing raised his head and said, "No worries, you wait here. I'll go to the back to look for your sister myself." Zhouing gave him a look, then went out and followed Mrs. Ning to the old madam's small courtyard. Seeing the women waiting inside, Zhouing greeted them one by one. When she saw Yang Wanyu wasn't there, she deliberately asked Yang Wanning, "Oh, where's Yang Wanyu? She's supposed to be the main character today, isn't she?" She said she's tired and would come out when it's time to set off. Yang Wanning blinked and replied. She knew the real reason was that rumors and gossip about the Yang family had already spread throughout the capital this morning. Yang Wanyu, the daughter of Mrs. Chui, was the main target of everyone's gossip. Words such as hypocrisy, meanness, viciousness, and ruthlessness were all directed at her. Some even felt she was the continuation of Mrs. Cuy's evil plans. She was in a worse spot than Zhouing when the Gu family was in trouble. Some gossip even concluded that the first prince would break off her engagement soon. So Yang Wanyu couldn't bear it anymore and shut herself in. Chapter 562 Morning 2. Yeah, yesterday's incident was too much of a blow to her. Mrs. Ning handed Zhouing a cup of tea. "Thank you." Zhouing nodded with a smile and took the teacup. Mrs. Zhao sneered and said, "Isn't she just too ashamed to face others?" There were no outsiders here, so there was no need to hide it. To be honest, if I were her, I would have killed myself from the shame. She would be in deep trouble from the mess Mrs. Chui left behind. "Stop it. Mrs. Ning glared at her. Which part of it is wrong? Besides, Mrs. Chui harmed my unborn child, so it's already good that I'm not taking revenge. When Mrs. Ning heard this, she knew there was still resentment in Mrs. Zhao's heart. She did not try to persuade her, but gave her a warning look. She then told young Wanning, take care of your cousin-in-law. I'm going to the front. As soon as she left, young Wanning offered, cousin-in-law, they'll bring you to a side room to rest. Zhou nodded and followed her to the side room. When Mrs. Zhao saw this, she also stood up. Since even the person who should be here the most isn't even here, one can't be bothered to mourn for my enemy. After saying that, she stood up and left. When Mrs. Zhang saw this, she got up and swept her eyes across the room. She laughed at the soft couch that the old madam often lay on and said, Madam, you have schemed your entire life, but in the end, you have lost everyone's favor. I'm curious if you regret it now. I think the young residence is about to topple. I wouldn't mind watching to its very end. Zhou Ying, who was keeping tabs at the young residence, was surprised when she heard Mrs. Zhang's words. It seemed that she had a lot of grievances against the old madam. She seemed to be someone who understood the situation they were in. Zhou Ying wondered what kind of story she had. However, seeing that she was harmless, Zhou Ying had no intention of asking. After confirming that no one else was in the courtyard, she asked young Wanning, what do you plan to do next? Do you think my father will chase us out of the house in anger if we don't attend Mrs. and Madam Cui's funeral? Yesterday, your cousin mentioned this to me. I think it's better for you to send them off. No matter how the Chui family and their extended family treated you, Madam Chui is still your grandmother. It might look bad on you if you are adamant about cutting your relationship with them and refusing to send them off. Moreover, all the evil deeds were attributed to Mrs. Chui. Although Madam Chui treated you badly on the surface, she never harmed you, right? Besides, you guys already fought yesterday, but young Shirching didn't make things difficult for you, right? But I can't take this anymore. A little forbearance will preserve the plan. If it really doesn't work, make a fuss about the dowry. If he were to prepare a dowry for Yang Wanyu, it would be impossible for him not to touch your mother's dowry. Yang Wanning's eyes lit up. Yes, my mother's dowry mustn't fall into the hands of the enemy's daughter. But with such a big problem related to the Chui family, will King Hui still marry Wanyu? You should know that your father is on King Hu's side, right? Yang Wanyu paused when she heard that. That's right. Based on the various signs in her previous life, her father should be one of the trusted aides of King Hui. Otherwise, he would not have been promoted so quickly. He definitely had something on King Hui. Even if it wasn't fatal, it was still something major. Therefore, as long as young Shirching was still alive, Prince Hui would not give up on marrying young Wanyu unless it was absolutely necessary. Cousin-in-law, why do you think King Hui didn't do anything when my father went to prison? Maybe he doesn't dare to. I heard the emperor is in charge of the Chui family's affairs. Another reason is that he might still be useful. Chapter 563 Sever Relationship 1. After hearing that, young Wanning looked at her in surprise, and soon she laughed. That's right. The emperor was a person with many doubts. If someone did something under his nose, wouldn't that invite disaster? After that, the two women chatted for a while longer. They never imagined they wouldn't need to wait until young Wanyu's wedding, as a perfect opportunity presented itself for the siblings to sever their relationship with young Shirching. Young Shirching could not fall asleep at night as he lay on his bed, tossing and turning. In his mind, the scene of Mother God appearing at the execution ground in broad daylight kept flashing. This reminded him that before Mrs. Chui died, she kept nagging about Mrs. Gu asking for her life. Since the gods have appeared, ghosts should also exist, right? The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he was. He could not help but believe 80% of Mrs. Siwa's words. Therefore, the next day, he asked the butler to find a rather famous Taoist priest, Ling Fengzi. He brought the priest directly to Mrs. Gus' grave and dug it up. He used blood threads, Tao talismans, and 99 soul-suppressing nails to nail Mrs. Gus' coffin firmly. Gu Chungrui found out after receiving a note from the spy he had sent to the young residents. He quickly went straight to King Rui, and had someone inform the young siblings and Zhouing. He then promptly rushed to Mrs. Gus' grave. On the way, when Zhouing went down to buy some offerings, she deliberately found a young beggar and promised to give him 100 pounds of black flour if he could spread the news. When the group of people arrived at Mrs. Gus' grave, the Taoist priest was almost done with his work. Moreover, Zhouing could tell that this Taoist priest was someone capable. The talisman he placed on the coffin really had a certain effect. Therefore, before she got off the carriage, he drew out Guard Chu's sword and rushed forward to chop the Taoist priest's hand. "How dare you!" After the Taoist priest dodged it, he tried to counterattack. Gu Chungrui came over and kicked him in the back. "Stinky priest, are you courting death?" He quickly pressed the Taoist priest to the ground. Yang Shiqing noticed the couple, and his face went pale. When he saw King Rui not far away, as well as Yang Wanning and her brother with a murderous expression, his legs went weak, and he nearly fell to the ground. When the butler saw this, he collapsed to the ground and trembled. Soon, Yang Wanning and her brother rushed over. They looked at Yang Shiqing with bloodshot eyes and shouted, "You are no longer our father." After that, Yang Wanning started kicking the butler. The butler turned around and wanted to run, but Guard Chu walked over and held him down. When Yang Wanning and her brother saw this, they punched and kicked him mercilessly. The one they wanted to hit the most was Yang Shiqing, but they could only vent their anger on the butler because of their status. However, when he saw their ruthlessness, Yang Shiqing knew what they were thinking. At this thought, a trace of viciousness flashed across his eyes. "Stop hitting me. Stop it. This is master's intention. I'm just following orders." The butler could not take it anymore and immediately shouted. The Taoist priest, whom Gu Chungrui held down, immediately added, "I'm just doing as I'm paid. This matter has nothing to do with me." "Accepting money for this? You're going against the heavens. Aren't you afraid of getting struck by lightning?" "I am doing this to survive." The Taoist priest smiled bitterly. "I'll give you one chance. Remove the things on top of the coffin and don't damage the bones one bit." Chapter 564 Sever Relationship 2. No. It's impossible unless we change a coffin. The Taoist priest shook his head. When Zhouing saw this, she immediately took out a banknote worth 500 taels of silver and handed it to Guard Chu. "Sorry to trouble you, but can you help us make a trip and buy the best coffin you can?" "Mrs. Gu, you're too polite," Guard Chu said as he received the silver notes. Buy more joss paper." The Taoist priest raised his head and reminded him. Guard Chu shot him a cold glance and immediately turned around to leave. Yang Wanning and her brother were also tired. They stopped hitting the butler. They looked at Yang Shiqing with hatred. A moment later, Yang Wanning said, "Since my mother has no place in your heart, we won't force you any longer. Today, we siblings represent our mother's decision to separate from you. From now on, our surnames will be changed to Gu, and we will no longer be an eyesore to you." "Impossible. It was your mother who caused trouble." Without waiting for Yang Shiqing to finish, Yang Wanning laughed and said, "It seems Mrs. Cui has a high position in your heart. More than 10 years of being married, and the Gu family supported you all this time." 66 sets of dowry had supported the Yang family for more than a decade, but it was nothing compared to the rumors spat by Mrs. Cui. "You are really a good example of a husband." "I agree with this. Although the Gu family has declined, it's not to the extent that they can't afford to raise 2 children. From today onwards, my aunt and you are no longer husband and wife." Gu Chungrui echoed. "Yang Qinglin, what about you? Are you going to mess around with them too?" Yang Shiqing immediately looked at Yang Qinglin. He would never allow this divorce. Otherwise, the Yang family would collapse once the Gu family's dowry was taken away. "Who is messing around? You don't even respect my mother's corpse. Do you even treat me as your son? I'm innocent and easily deceived, but I'm not stupid." Yang Qinglin clenched his fists and questioned loudly. After shouting that, his tears fell. What happened during this period made him realize that his father had no intention of caring for them. He only cared about his benefits and his future. But Yang Chenglin never expected his father would not even let a dead person off for profit. If they had a conflict of interest in the future, his father would definitely abandon him. This matter is non-negotiable. Do you want to deal with it yourself, or do you want to bring it to the authorities? Gu Chengrui said. When Yang Shicheng turned to look at him again, his eyes were filled with killing intent. However, Gu Chengrui did not retreat. Instead, he looked at him coldly. About 15 minutes later, Yang Shicheng saw that he had no room for compromise. He snorted coldly and said, "I'll satisfy your request. However, this cemetery belongs to our Yang family. Since Mrs. Gu is no longer our Yang family's daughter-in-law, please move her away as soon as possible." I have the same intention. I don't think my aunt wants to be buried with her enemy. Gu Chengrui looked at the Taoist priest and said, "Help us find a good place with good feng shui, and we'll forgive you. How about it?" Okay. The Taoist priest nodded repeatedly. "If you dare do a shoddy job, we will ask Mother God to teach you a lesson," Zhouing added. When the Taoist priest heard the word Mother God, he immediately remembered the lightning on the execution ground. He couldn't help but shiver and nod repeatedly. Definitely, definitely. I'll give you a piece of advice. Don't do any more evil in this life. Otherwise, you might be whipped for the rest of your life. Understood, the Taoist priest said, twitching his lips. After saying that, he immediately turned around and took a mat. He covered the coffin and pulled out the nails. After removing the nails, he went aside to look for the cemetery under Gu Shengrui's supervision. Chapter 565 Sever Relationship 3. When Guard Chu returned, Gu Chengrui and Zhou Ying had already settled the cemetery matter after buying a plot of land from the local village chief. After that, the Taoist priest helped move Mrs. Gu's grave. After arriving at the grave, Zhou Ying spread out her divine sense and scanned the cemetery's surroundings. Although she knew little about feng shui, she could see this was a good spot for Mrs. Gu's grave. At the very least, it didn't make her uncomfortable. After the burial, Yang Wanning and Yang Chenglin burned a large amount of joss paper and cried bitterly. After they were done, the group of people quickly returned to the capital. King Rui and the others went to the Yang residence, while Zhou Ying took the opportunity to return home. After taking the list of dowries and some snacks, she asked Haitang to prepare a table of vegetarian food before returning to the Yang residence. When she arrived in the living room, she saw that everyone was there, so she placed the snacks on the table. She placed King Rui's favorite hawthorn snack before him and said, "Everyone, have this as a snack for now. We'll have a meal at our house later." Gu Chengrui got up and handed the dowry list to Yang Shicheng. "I'm sure over the years, other than the land and shops, there is nothing else left. We will not be calculative. You just need to return the land and shops." Yang Shicheng heaved a sigh of relief, as he had bought a few properties during the disaster. Although the income wasn't much, he could at least maintain the expenses of the residence. He looked at the siblings and asked, "Are you really going to change your surname to Gu?" "Yes, you still have 3 children anyway, but my mother only has us." When Yang Wanning said this, her eyes flashed, and she added provocatively, "Of course, if no one cares for you when you're old, we'll help you take care of your old age." In her previous life, Yang Wanyu left her with no one to rely on in her previous life. In the end, she even killed her with her own hands. Yang Wanyu could forget about living a good life in this lifetime. Yang Wanning wanted Yang Wanyu to lose everything, bit by bit, and taste the despair of her previous life. Of course, she still acted professionally, making people think she was sincere in her offer. She had her own motives for saying this. She did not want King Rui to think that the siblings were ungrateful children. Yang Chenglin nodded as well. Yang Shicheng was so angry that he wanted to beat her up, but he had to admit that what she said made sense. Based on Yang Wanyu and Yang Chengsen's attitude toward him these 2 days, he knew he would not have a good life if he were cared for by them in his old age. It seemed he had to hurry up and have another 1 or 2 sons. Because Gu Shengrui's demands weren't too much, he quickly gave in. He took out all the title deeds from the shops belonging to the Gu family and happily wrote down a separation letter. Just as he was done, Yang Wanyu rushed in and yelled, "Father, You can't return the dowry to them. There are 2 manors and shops that are already mine. Don't mess around. Young Shurchen glared at her. At the same time, Young Wanting sneered. Don't tell me you want to use my mother's dowry as your dowry? Where's your face? Hearing her words, Yang Wanyu suddenly remembered the rumors from before. She went forward and tried clawing at her face. Seeing this, Yang Wanning did not stand still. She took a step to the right and grabbed her left wrist. She stepped forward and turned her toes to pin Yang Wanyu's leg. She pressed down hard on the crook of her leg. At the same time, she placed the back of her hand behind Yang Wanyu and pressed her down forcefully. It took a while to describe, but it happened in an instant. Before Yang Wanyu could react, she felt pain in her arms and legs. She knelt on the ground with a shocked expression. Yang Shurchen was shocked and quickly asked Yang Wanning, "When did you learn martial arts?" Chapter 566 Sever Relationship 4. I didn't go out of my way to learn it. I only followed my cousin-in-law to learn 2 moves for self-defense. Yang Wanning looked at Yang Wanyu and added, I won't be making things difficult for you because we're related. But that doesn't mean one will ignore that you've harmed me every step of the way. That little bit of blood relationship can only go so far. In the future, we will no longer be related. If you dare harm me again, one won't be polite anymore. Yang Wanyu immediately looked at Yang Shurchen. However, Yang Shurchen was not happy about her either. If it weren't for her scheming about her dowry, the Yang family wouldn't have reached this point. Wanting is right. You should restrain your temper. Otherwise, you'll only cause more trouble in the future. Yang Wanyu looked at her father in disbelief. She did not dare to make a fuss. Instead, she looked at Yang Wanning unwillingly and spat. Let me go. Yang Wanning did not make things difficult for her after hearing that. She simply stood up and retreated to the side. Without making a fuss, Yang Shurchen got up and brought Gu Chengrue and Yang Wanning to the government office to settle the rest of the procedures. Meanwhile, Zhouing asked Chuanxi, Mrs. Sun, and Yang Qinglin's errand boy, Xiao Shu, to pack up the siblings' belongings. It was mainly their clothes, bedding, and personal belongings. They then pulled 2 big carts filled with stuff and returned to the Gu residence with King Rue. Everyone ate lunch once they returned to the Gu residence. After lunch, King Rue and Gu Chengrue went to work. Zhouing arranged for the 2 siblings to stay in the side courtyard. Yang Wanning, no, Gu Wanning, quickly shook her head and said, Cousin-in-law, we can just stay in the wing room and save some firewood. There is a lot of firewood here, so don't worry. Moreover, it is convenient for you to have your own courtyard if you have a friend coming over. Zhouing shook her head and replied. Besides, she was not used to them hanging around. It would be better if they could leave her some personal space. Sorry to trouble you, cousin-in-law. Gu Wanning did not insist, and she thanked her. Afterward, the siblings brought their luggage and servants to the side courtyard. Zhouing sent a helper to help the siblings clean up and do rough work. After an entire afternoon, word spread that Yang Shurchen had hired a Taoist priest to bind Mrs. Gu's soul, and that Gu Wanning and her brother had left the Yang family. Of course, most of everyone, especially the women, agreed with Gu Wanning and her brother's actions. They felt that Yang Shurchen had gone too far. Unfortunately, there were also some selfish people who felt that Yang Shurchen was right and that Gu Wanning and her brother were too stubborn. Ultimately, it was a mostly positive reaction regarding Gu Wanning and her brother. On the other hand, Yang Shurchen was furious when he heard the news. He did not expect that his secretive actions would spread. He didn't need to guess to know it had something to do with the Gu family. He now despised the couple. Regardless, he did not care about them for the time being. He quickly went straight to Mrs. Ning to discuss the matter of Yang Wanyu's dowry. He bought whatever was cheap and practical. He avoided anything expensive at all costs. As a result, despite the fact that they had prepared 40 sets of dowry, it cost less than 10,000 taels of silver. This included a small manor on approximately 200 acres of land and a small shop of roughly 20 square meters on the city's eastern outskirts. In the evening, Sun Miaoka finished her meal alone and went to check the accounts of her residence for the past few years. At this moment, Qing Tao came over with a cup of tea and said, Consort, I heard that His Highness helped Yang Wanning break away from the Yang family today and moved to the Gu residence. Chapter 567. Some thoughts. She has finally freed herself from a sea of suffering. Otherwise, she might not get anything in the end. Sun Miaoka stopped writing and spoke. Aren't you jealous? She hasn't even married yet, and His Highness is already helping her so much. Qing Tao said indignantly. Did someone say something to you? Sun Miaoka asked. No, I just feel wronged for you. Qing Tao shook her head. Is His Highness mistreating me? No, but, Qing Tao, from the moment I decided to marry into this family, I knew I couldn't monopolize His Highness. To be honest, I'm already grateful for us being able to treat each other respectfully. As for Yang Wanting, honestly, she doesn't have much weight in His Highness' heart. The ones he really holds dear are the Gu couple. So in the future, over the years, you have heard of many fights between wives and consorts, but in the end, none of them live comfortably, no matter who wins or loses. For example, Mrs. Chui had successfully caused the death of Mrs. Gu, but what did she get in the end? Did Lord Yang save her with all his heart? It's obvious that even she wasn't that important in Lord Yang's heart. You saw my aunt clearly all these years. She is my uncle's wife and can bully the concubines at will. My uncle also respects her very much. However, my uncle will still marry a new girl every 2 or 3 years. Do you think she really is happy? No, she's bitter on the inside. It's just that her heart had been in pain too many times and had become numb. She had no choice but to only close one eye to this. Liaoka was in a daze as she said this. She continued, but look at my father. For many years, my grandmother has brought up taking in concubines, and the officialdom even sent him many beauties. But he didn't want any of them. What does this mean? Whether a man is a playboy or not, it all depends on his intentions. As a woman, the most important thing we can do is try our best to give him a warm home and present her best side to him. At the same time, we must protect ourselves. The rest depends on the man. The key was not to give away your true feelings first. Otherwise, your feelings might be mangled once you want to take them back. Of course, she did not dare to say this out loud. Otherwise, if word got out, she could forget about taking another step forward with His Highness in the future. Seeing that Sun Miaoka had thought it through clearly, Qing Tao did not say anything else and obediently retreated. As for Sun Miaoka, she wasn't in the mood to write anymore, because she did not know if she could keep her heart from wavering before the outstanding King Rue in the future. Would she become as ruthless and unscrupulous as the Empress or Mrs. Chui? On the other end, Zhouing waited for most of the residents to fall asleep before quietly leaving the house with Gu Chungrui. They went to a small courtyard north of the city and found the little beggar who had helped her spread Yang Shiqing's scandal during the day. She handed him the 100 pounds of black flour and said, Guzi, hide these well. It should be enough for you to eat for a winter. Guzi looked at the big bag of black flour and asked with a troubled expression, Sister, can you help me keep it and give us 10 pounds a month? Reason? Uncle Chi, who protected us before, has left. A group of children like us can't guard this. How old is the oldest of you? Me. I'm 12 this year. At this moment, a young beggar walked over and replied. His eyes were fierce, like a wolf cub, and his footsteps were light. It was obvious that he had practiced some sort of martial art. You know martial arts? Gu Shengru's eyes lit up. Chapter 568. Good Seedling. Zhouing frowned because his body had a bloody aura when she saw him. There was an 80% chance he had taken someone's life previously. I know how to fight. Previously, Uncle Chi was afraid we would be bullied, so he taught us a set of fist techniques. The young man looked at Gu Chungrui and replied, In other words, all of you know martial arts? Yes, but some are good at it while others are average. What did the uncle you mentioned do before? Will he come back? What do you want? The young man looked at him warily and asked, Nothing special. We want to recruit some guards for our place, but I don't know what your standards are. Guards? Yes, guards. My uncle used to be an escort mercenary. After the disaster, he was trapped in the capital. Seeing that we were pitiful, he stayed behind to protect us. Some time ago, He said that he had received a new escort mission, so he returned to his hometown with some people. Gu Chungrui nodded thoughtfully and replied, I see. Do consider whether you want to continue being beggars or follow us. The young boy nodded and took out a bag. After putting in a small amount of black flour, he said, Sorry to trouble you, but I'll give you a reply at this time. 3 days later, Okay, but let me make it clear first. I only want someone with solid martial arts capabilities. After Gu Chungrui finished speaking, he picked up the bag of flour and left with Zhouing. After they were far away, Zhouing put away the bag and asked, Didn't you say that the situation in the capital is complicated? Aren't you afraid of being cheated? We can't give up eating because of fear of choking, right? That kid is a good seedling for practicing martial arts, so I want to try to recruit him. All right, you know what you're doing. However, I have to remind you that there's blood on his hands. Are you sure? I'm sure. It seems that we really have to investigate properly. Gu Chungrui nodded seriously. The next morning, Mingyu came over. Seeing that Gu Wanning was fine, she hurriedly went to train her female soldiers. Meanwhile, Yang Chenglin went back to the academy. Zhou Ying returned the 50,000 taels of silver to Gu Wanning and said, Since you've moved out of the wolf's lair, you can hold on to the money for yourself. Thank you, cousin-in-law. It just so happens that I want to buy a house for Chenglin. You've thought it through, but I think you should wait a little longer. Otherwise, if Yang Shiqing finds out that you have a lot of money in your hands, he might slander your reputation. Moreover, Chenglin is still young and will be living in the academy most of the time. It's better to let him live here if he needs to for a few more years. When he's older, only then do we get him ready for adulthood. Gu Wanning paused when she heard that. She nodded and replied, You're right. Okay, they'll buy it only after I get married. Yes, the most important thing now is to prepare the dowry. Later, you can discuss with Mrs. Sun and draft a list. Your cousin and I will help you on this. Thank you, cousin-in-law. If it wasn't for you two helping me, I'm afraid I would have been in a terrible position. We can help you for now, but we can't help you forever. So, you must learn from this and mature as soon as possible. After all, there are many things that we can't interfere with after you enter King Rui's residence. We might not be able to help you after that. Gu Wanning nodded in agreement. I will. There's still a long way to go in the future. I'm sure I'll be independent as soon as possible. The two of them chatted for a while more. Zhouing asked her to keep the silver notes, and the two went back to practice some more martial arts. After 2 days, once Gu Chungrui was done with the matters here, the three brought Lin Etienne to their manor. When she saw some small rape seeds that were ready to be eaten, she picked a bunch and filled half a basket. After returning to the courtyard, Zhouing handed it to Gu Wanning and said, Take it to the kitchen and wash it. We'll go get something else. After saying that, Zhouing returned to her room. After putting down her cloak, she went to her inner space to get a piece of cured meat, about 2 pounds of dried mushrooms, and a bag of black fungus mushrooms. When she returned to the kitchen, she saw the 2 women washing the vegetables. Zhouing took a little of the 3 ingredients she brought and soaked them. She then checked the ingredients that Widow Wu had prepared. They were radishes, cabbages, some dried vegetables, and a bowl of black noodles. Zhouing pondered for a moment and decided to use some bacon and dried hemp vegetables as well. Zhouing started stir-frying the mushrooms, pickling the cabbages in vinegar, and stir-frying the eggs with black fungus mushrooms. She originally wanted to mix them with shredded radishes, but had to change plans when there wasn't white sugar here. She stewed the radishes instead. Chapter 570 depends on his capabilities. After knowing what to cook, the 3 of them got busy. Around noon, the scrumptious dishes were served, especially the dish filled with bacon and hemp vegetables. It was salty, fragrant, and very tempting just after smelling it. Gu Wanning couldn't help but eat one as soon as it was out of the pot. However, Widow Wu's heart ached as she looked at the oil can. Head Fong had found this piece of suet with great difficulty. She hadn't expected. After Zhouing saw her expression, she just smiled and did not take it to heart. When treating a guest to a meal, she had to let the guest eat comfortably. Otherwise, she might as well not treat them. As for the oil, she could just go out and buy a pig in the afternoon, or even take some out of her inner space. Sure enough, Chin-hee and the other two ate well, and were extremely satisfied. Zhou couldn't even eat her fill. In the end, she could only take 2 buns from her inner space to eat. After the meal, they rested briefly before Widow Wu and Gu Wanning went to the shed to help. On the other hand, Zhou took Headfong and went out to collect the pigs with an ox cart. After driving for an entire afternoon, they finally bought a pig that weighed more than 100 pounds in one of the villages. On the way back, Zhou asked, "Uncle Fong, do you have a successor in this manner?" Mrs. Zhou, what do you mean by that? Headfong was stunned for a moment before he turned his head and asked nervously, "Have you heard that we bought another manor?" "I heard, but that place. I heard it's a place that can't grow anything. As long as it can grow grass, it will be fine. Our idea is that that place will mainly engage in livestock farming and plant some fruits and vegetables for the restaurant to use in the future. I noticed that you're familiar with the surrounding manors, so I want you to go over and give it a try at managing our manor. As for this manor, it's already stable. As long as someone is keeping an eye on it, it will be fine as long as nothing goes wrong. Of course, I won't force you if you're unwilling." Headfong went silent for a moment after hearing this. Ultimately, he nodded and replied, "I'll listen to Madam's arrangements. As long as you think I can take over the new manor, I'll go over." To be honest, anyone literate and stern enough could manage the current manor other than growing vegetables and farming crops. However, it was different in the new manor. From Zhou Ying's words, the stuff they were planning for the new manor would be their restaurant's main source of income. Even selling the livestock elsewhere would earn them a lot of money, which would also increase his value. All right, we can only start after spring. If there's no suitable person to take over your position, quickly train one. After spring, we will need to go over there and build some houses, cattle pens, sheep pens, and so on. I understand. My eldest son has been managing the manor with me. Do you think he can do it? Whether he can do it or not, it depends on his capabilities. Let him manage it for some time and give him more practice. All right, I'll start making arrangements when I get back. Later, Zhou asked him about the situation in the nearby manors. She was a little surprised when she learned that all the surrounding manors belonged to officials. What surprised her was that a manor under Yang Qinglin's name specialized in farming. However, the head of the manor had been a little dishonest in the past 2 days and had been selling their stuff. After returning home, Zhou ordered her help to slaughter the pigs as soon as possible. She then personally treated everyone in the manor to a meal of pork and vegetables. She later asked Headfong to sell a portion of the meat to the people in the manor at a fair price. In the end, only 2 plates of pork ribs and a piece of suet were left. She handed them over to Widow Wu. After everyone left, Zhou told Gu Wanning about the situation of the manor under Yang Qinglin's name and said, "In my opinion, you should hurry up and deal with it. At least, you should get rid of Mrs. Cys Min. Otherwise, it would be difficult to take it back from them after they ruin it." Chapter 571 Childbirth. I can't believe their guts. Gu Wanning huffed angrily. It's not too late to take action. Moreover, since they started this, you can take the opportunity to establish your hold over them. Gu Chengcheng reminded her. That's true. We'll go over tomorrow. Okay, they'll ask Lin Etienne to accompany you. If the people there are unusable, you'd better sell them off quickly. I understand. Gu Wanning nodded in agreement. The next morning, Lin Etienne accompanied Gu Wanning and set off. However, they did not go directly to the manor. Instead, they went home to get the manor's head and his family's contracts. Lin Etienne brought the other 3 guards along as well. With their company, Gu Wanning had no more worries. When they arrived at the manor, they reminded them who was in charge. When they realized that the head of the manor was unrelenting, they immediately checked the accounts and took back the money he had earned from selling livestock without permission. They then sold these people to the south of the country. She then appointed the manor's head that Mrs. Gu had chosen previously. Over the next few days, Gu Wanning brought her people to the other 3 manors and checked the accounts. If there were any problems, she would replace the people there. Meanwhile, Zhou was helping to take care of the shed in the manor. With her joining in, Gu Chungrui wasn't as stressed and had more time to continue learning his medical skills. 5 days later, King Kang's consort, Zhou Jiaying, gave birth to a baby girl in the early morning. It was only at night that she slowly woke up. Seeing that only Nanny Yu was in the room, she struggled to poke her head out and shouted, "Mrs. Yu, mistress, you woke up. How do you feel now?" Mrs. Yu quickly walked over and asked, "I'm fine. I'm just hungry and want to eat something." "Okay, please wait for a moment. I'll warm up the porridge for you." After speaking, Mrs. Yu left and brought over a small bowl of red date millet porridge. "Mistress, hurry up and give it a sip." This had been cooking for the entire afternoon. Zhou Jiang pushed it away and said, "It's too hot, so let's wait for a while." "Has His Highness been here?" "He did, and he brought some tonics over." After looking at Mistress, he left when he noticed you were asleep. "He even told us to take good care of you, and if you need anything, just let him know." "Did he say anything about asking for a seal?" "No, he probably wanted to wait until you woke up." Mrs. Yu shook her head. "Oh." Zhou Jiaying also felt that what she said made sense, so she lay down and rested for a while before eating the porridge. After breakfast, her family came instead of King Kong the next morning. After sitting for a while, Mother Zhou told her a few things to take note of and when to see the baby. Zhou Jiaqing sat down and asked, "Sis, how do you feel?" "Fortunately, the birth went smoothly and I didn't suffer much." Zhou Jiaying carefully looked at her face and said, "Good. There's no mark on your face. Of course, our father is the principle of medicine. Don't be happy too early. You have to be more careful in the future. By the way, I heard Mother is talking about your marriage. Is there anyone you like?" Zhou Jiaqing shook her head dejectedly. She was in a difficult situation. The good ones didn't fancy her, and the others were too lousy to be her husband. She was placed between a rock and a hard place. Thinking of this, she huffed indignantly. "It's all Zhou Ying's fault. If she hadn't caused me to lose face at the banquet, I would have become King Rui's consort long ago. I wouldn't have to be left at home to be picked and chosen." Zhou Jiaying was speechless. Although she wasn't there then, she knew of the incident afterward. To put it bluntly, Zhou Jiaqing was acting brainlessly. Her schemes failed, and she even got herself into trouble, ruining her reputation. Chapter 572 Uneasiness, sister. You have to think of a way to help me get back at her. How do you want to do that? Anthing, I'm not having a good time, so she can forget about being comfortable. Zhou Jiaqing became listless when she said this. She told her sister how she tried to send a spy into the Gu residence, but was rejected by Zhouing at a glance. Zhou Jiaying smiled and said, "You know how to use your brain but are still immature. So what if a servant girl successfully entered the Gu residence and climbed into Gu Shengru's bed? She was just a servant girl. At most, she would cause some trouble for her. If Zhouing wanted to get rid of her, it would be easy. Then what should we do? If I remember correctly, they have been married for more than 3 years, but there has been no news of Zhou Ying's pregnancy, right? I only noticed after you brought it up." Zhou Jiaqing's eyes lit up. "It's true. You got married a year later than her and already have a child, but there's no news of her pregnancy. Don't worry about this. It'll help you vent your anger later." "How?" "Secrets cannot be revealed," Zhou Jiaying said with a stern face. She knew Zhou Jiaqing was simply unable to hide a secret. If she leaked it, wouldn't her plans fail before she could implement them? Zhou Jiaqing still wanted to say something, but Mother Zhou walked over and said, "Your sister has just given birth and is tired. You'd better not bother her too much." She looked at Zhou Jiaying and added, "Your dad asked me to bring 2 herbal recipes over, and I gave them to Mrs. Yu. Take good care of yourself. We will come to see you in 2 days." After saying that, Mother Zhou pulled Zhou Jiaqing up. "Hurry up, let's go. Let your sister have a good rest." After saying that, she greeted Mrs. Yu goodbye as Mrs. Yu sent them out. When Mrs. Yu returned, she saw Zhou Jiaying still had her eyes wide open. So she asked, "Madam, do you want to eat something?" "There's no need. Hasn't His Highness been here yet?" "No. After His Highness left the morning court, He hasn't returned. I think something happened. I see. Zhou Jiaying responded and closed her eyes. However, she felt a little uneasy. Ever since she deliberately fainted on the street, the number of times she saw His Highness could be counted on one hand. She didn't know if he was deliberately hiding from her, or if he was really busy. Also, the princess consort would be married into the family after the new year, so Zhou Jiaying did not have much time left. Thus, she had to regain her husband's favor quickly. Otherwise, she and her daughter would not have an easy time in the future. Zhouing stayed at the manor for more than 10 days. Just as the first prince and young Wanyu were about to get married, the three finally returned to the capital with a cart of vegetables. There were bunches of rapeseed, spinach, and cabbage. After entering the capital, Gu Chungrui brought a basket of each into the palace. Zhouing distributed the rest to Zhou Huaiming, King Rui, King En, and the Minister of Works. Later, she returned to her residence with Gu Wanning. On the other end, when the emperor found out that Gu Chungrui had come with vegetables, he immediately summoned him to his chambers. When he saw the green and juicy vegetables, he asked in surprise, "Are these really grown in the greenhouse?" "Of course. I just harvested them before returning to the capital, so they're still fresh. This is my reason for my visit." Gu Chungrui said, Good, good, good. The greenhouse vegetables are successful. In the future, our winter days will be much better." The emperor nodded repeatedly. He thought of something and asked, "Can you only grow these leafy vegetables?" "No, but leafy vegetables have a short growing period, so they can be eaten in about a month." Chapter 573 Dowry. That's true. Would the other vegetables be ready by the new year? Tough to say. If there's a possibility of early maturity, we can harvest them. However, they'll definitely be ready on the 15th of the first lunar month. The 15th is fine. It's an important festival. If you manage it well, it'll be a great achievement. This is my honor. If you have no other instructions, I will take my leave, Gu Chungrui said. Go. If there's anything, report it in time. The emperor nodded. After Gu Chungrui left, the emperor ordered Eunuch Li to bring all the vegetables to the imperial kitchen. At dinner, he wanted to taste the quality of the vegetables and see if they differed from those grown near the hot springs. On the other end, Zhouing had just returned home when the little beggar Guzi, renamed Qitong, ran out to welcome her, saying, "Madam, you're back. This servant will help you carry your luggage." "All right, send the clothes to the main courtyard for Shizhu." Zhouing smiled as she handed him the cloth bag she used to wrap her clothes. She later handed the remaining vegetables to Zhou Dasheng and the others. As she walked in, Zhou Dasheng whispered, "Qitong is quite smart and lively. If he's properly nurtured, he'll definitely be someone successful in the future." Zhouing smiled and nodded. If it weren't for his intelligence, she wouldn't have chosen him to spread the news in the first place. Thinking of this, Zhouing solemnly instructed Zhou Dasheng, "All the more you should teach him. Let him learn as much as possible. Also, you should teach the young ones how to read too. They might be useful in the future." Understood. Zhou Dasheng nodded in agreement. After dinner, Zhouing asked, "Rui, what wedding gift do you think you're giving the first prince? He's marrying a consort, so we can't give him a gift according to King Rui's standards. I think it's better to give him a purple sand tea set. It's not expensive, but it's practical." "Let's go with that." Zhouing nodded in agreement. If it weren't for making peace on the surface, she wouldn't even bother to go to the first prince's wedding, let alone give a congratulatory gift. After entering the inner space at night, Gu Chungrui returned to the villa to read some medical books after working on the grassland. Meanwhile, Zhouing continued to deal with matters within the various mother god temples. They soon realized that the previous batch of fish, including the small fish in the river, had almost been fished out. It was clear how much meat the people lacked. As the fish in her interspace bred to their previous population, she left the eggs behind and distributed the remainder to severely malnourished areas via the mother god temple. Chapter 574 Unforgivable. This is indeed an opportunity. Just send one person in. Remember, you must be smart, and it doesn't matter if you succeed or not as long as you don't expose us. King Kong said solemnly. Roger that. Oh, right. Do I need to make a move at King Rui's consort? There's no hurry. We have to wait until Gu Wanning enters the residence. That way, it'll be better for us to act once they fight. Seventh Su smiled wickedly and didn't say anything else. Zhouing also realized that the blood aura on Seventh Su's body was much thicker than before. This kid had done many bad things recently. It was unforgivable that he wanted to stir up trouble at King Rui's residence by using Gu Wanning. Therefore, Zhouing stuck a lightning talisman on his body after he went out. Instantly, his hair was burned and emitted a pungent smell as his clothes caught fire. He twitched twice, rolled his eyes, and fell to the ground. Fortunately, he was rescued in time. When King Kong heard the lightning strike, he immediately ran out in fear. It was the middle of winter, so how could there be thunder? When he saw Seventh Su's miserable state, he could not help but shudder. He recalled the thunderbolt on the execution ground. Could it be another warning from Mother God, however? His father and eldest brother had done worse. Why would they be fine when Seventh Su? King Kang's eyes narrowed at the thought of this, and he suddenly recalled how he had framed his eldest brother's subordinates to slip his spies in. Could it be? After confirming that Seventh Su's life was not in danger, he heaved a sigh of relief and glanced at everyone else. No one is allowed to tell anyone about what happened today. Otherwise, they'll kill you without mercy. At this point, he looked at the butler and said, Uncle Hong, keep an eye on this matter. Yes, Your Highness. Butler Hong responded and immediately dismissed the others. King Kong had his trusted aide carry Seventh Su into the guest room before calling for the residence physician to treat him. Mrs. Yu rushed over as the doctor entered and said, Your Highness, the young miss is sick. Quickly get the doctor. Go away. King Kong replied unhappily. Mrs. Yu was stunned when she heard this. This was His Highness' first child. How could he? King Kong finally realized that it was his daughter who was ill. He then added in a gentler tone, Wait, the doctor is busy inside. Ah yes. Mrs. Yu nodded and retreated aside. At the same time, she heaved a sigh of relief. It was fine as long as His Highness didn't hate the young miss. About an hour later, the doctor came out and said, Your Highness, the young master is now fine. He will just be in some pain, and he will recover in half a year. Half a year? Yes, the fastest. The burns on his body are not light. I'll entrust the young master to you. If there's any situation, report it to me immediately. Yes, the doctor replied. Just as he was about to return, Mother Yu shouted, Wait. King Kong paused before he remembered that his daughter was still sick. He hurriedly asked the doctor to bring his first aid kit over. After hesitating for a moment, he also followed them. After entering the house, he saw Zhou Jiaying pacing around with the baby in her arms. The doctor went forward for a checkup. Not a big problem. It's just that her stomach is a little bloated from eating cold food. Feed her some warm water and gently rub her stomach. Be more careful in the future. It is cold outside now, so you must not expose the child to the cold wind. Also, tell the nanny to be careful and to wait for her body to warm up before feeding her. Chapter 575 Anger. Zhou Jiaying glared at the nanny and said, Did you hear that? Be more careful in the future. If there's a next time, I'll take your life. This servant will remember this. I will be careful in the future. The nanny immediately knelt and kowtowed. All right, hurry up and carry her down to rub her stomach. Zhou Jiaying gave the baby to her after saying that. She rubbed her sore shoulders and turned around to go back to bed. Seeing this, Mrs. Yu coughed dryly and said, Madam, His Highness is here. Really? Your Highness? Zhou Jiaying had just turned around when she saw him leaving. She immediately got up and ran after him. However, King Kong was no longer there when she lifted her curtains. She looked at Mrs. Yu with dissatisfaction and asked, Mrs. Yu, why didn't you say so earlier? At that time, everyone was worried about the young miss. I forgot about it for a moment, Please punish me. Mrs. Yu knelt and asked for forgiveness. Just be careful in the future. Zhou Jiaying paused momentarily before asking, What's going on? Why did you take so long to call the doctor over? Mrs. Yu chased everyone out before whispering, I heard that 7th young Master Su was struck by lightning. The doctor only came over after treating 7th young Master Su's injuries. Speaking of this, she remembered King Kang's reaction. She was a little disappointed with his highness attitude, but since her madam was still in confinement from childbirth, she could only keep her mouth shut. Zhou Jiaying smiled. Being struck by lightning in the middle of winter. Wasn't that a punishment from the heavens? At this thought, her expression froze and turned into a look of fear. She solemnly instructed, Watch the servants in the courtyard. If anyone dares to spread the word, slap them until they shut up. I understand. You may leave. Zhou Jiaying went back to her bed and pondered. Could it be that King Kand was so busy that he didn't even have a chance to see her? But what were they busy with? Why would the heavens punish them? It seemed that she had to send a letter to her father to warn him. Zhouing looked at Zhou Jiaying's troubled face and pitied her a little. Zhou Jiaying and King Kong were childhood friends, and their marriage was done voluntarily. But it seemed that there was exaggeration in this voluntary act. At the very least, Zhou Jiaying wasn't living as happily as she had imagined. Zhouing retreated and headed toward the palace. It was already late at night, but the emperor was still engrossed in approving many requests. Suddenly, he stared blankly at a memorial. Li, do you still remember who oversaw the construction of the Shao River 5 years ago? This old servant is stupid and really can't remember. I will go and search for it immediately. After saying that, Eunuch Li turned around, went to the side hall, and began searching through the various memorials. Needless to say, the many documents were arranged neatly and were easy to search through. Soon, he found a scroll and hurriedly handed it to the emperor. Your Highness, we didn't send anyone to supervise the construction. It was supervised by the local officials after the imperial court allocated funds. The emperor took the memorial and opened it carefully to examine it. Sure enough, he did not send anyone down at the time, but the local officers were from the Marquis of Dingan's faction, or the people of the eldest prince. Yang Shiqing and Lord Bai from the Ministry of Works were also responsible for this matter. Is there any news from Xiaohong over the past 2 days? Since Chief Xiao accepted the mission, he rarely re-entered the palace and didn't send any useful news. It looks like they are well hidden. After the emperor finished speaking, he threw the memorial on his table. Chapter 576b worries. Zhouing saw that the memorial had not been closed, so she immediately went forward to take a look. It was a memorial from the south asking for funds to strengthen the river embankment. Thinking back to the conversation, she suddenly understood why the emperor was angry. She glanced at the memorial, saw Yang Ziqing's name, and smiled. Yang Shiqing was not far from death. Should she push the emperor to act so Yang Shiqing won't cause any more trouble? There was also the first prince. He was one of the masterminds behind the deaths of her original body and Gu Shengru's original body. Thinking of this, after the emperor fell asleep, she gave him another dream and told him about Yang Shiqing helping the first prince commit corruption. She also told him about the secret chamber in the Yang residence and the way to enter. After leaving, Zhouing returned the things she took from the secret chamber. She even returned the 100,000 taels of silver in the manner wholly intact. With this evidence, their doomsday would soon arrive. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, the emperor suddenly woke up with a head full of sweat. She was shocked by this and immediately left. Seeing it was getting late, she collected what she needed in her interspace and planted some corn. After she was done, she picked up a 5-pound watermelon and entered the villa. She sliced the watermelon and called Gu Changrui down. You've been reading for some time. Eat a piece of watermelon and take a rest. Thanks, it's great that you thought of that. Gu Changrui pulled her to sit down. He first handed her the middle piece before taking another piece and eating it. Zhouing looked at the watermelon in her hand and smiled. She lowered her head and started eating. After eating, Zhouing told him what she had seen and heard tonight, and that she had returned young Shiqing's gold and silver. Great. It's revenge for our bodies. Gu Chengrui laughed after hearing that. He then asked, so the fourth prince has planted a spy in King Rui's residence? Isn't that normal? I'm sure King Rui has spies in the others' residences too. That's true. If he didn't have some tricks up his sleeve, he probably wouldn't have lived until today. I just wonder what the fourth prince's goal is. From my experience watching royal dramas, the most effective way to provoke two women to fight is to do something regarding their children, especially involving sterilization medicine. It will definitely make the two women fight to the death. Gu Chengrui only sighed and said, to put it bluntly, women and children are just sacrifices in politics. After saying that, he stood up and disposed of the melon skin. After that, they took a shower together and went out of the inner space to go to bed. When Zhouing woke up again, the capital was in an uproar. The Yang family had been raided, all the family members had been captured, and the servants had been sold. The first prince was punished by personally reinforcing the South River embankment using his private coffers. The Marquis of Dingan's younger brother, Sun Wenhao, was also arrested and imprisoned, and Lord Bai from the Ministry of Works was also implicated. For a moment, the atmosphere in the capital became tense again. After dinner, Zhouing was teaching Gu Wanning martial arts when she realized Gu Wanning was daydreaming. She went up and asked, something on your mind? I guess so. I really didn't expect my father to have embezzled so much money. Gu Wanning replied thoughtfully. In her previous life, even though Yag Shiqing also had his corruption exposed, they did not recover much of the stolen money. It seemed that it was all used up by those three women. The Chui family women lived a much more luxurious life, especially after Yang Wanyu married the first prince. Gu Wanning remembered that Yang Wanyu had said that the first prince doted on her by gifting them all those luxurious goods. Now that she thought about it, those weren't gifts from the first prince. Those were bought after Yang Shiqing finally dared to spend the embezzled money once the first prince gained power. At the thought of this, she felt aggrieved for her mother. Yang Shiqing's salary had been solely for his personal use for the past several years. Gu Wanning's mother never spent even a single penny he earned after marrying him. But her ending was. Chapter 577a, full stop. Just when Zhouing thought that Gu Wanning had softened her heart, Gu Wanning suddenly said, good. The more corrupted, the worse his outcome will be. Yup, since there's no more relationship between you two siblings can just live your own lives. That's right, I still have Chenglin. Gu Wanning smiled. Her previous life had already become a dream that could not be repeated, so she needed to grasp this life and live it well. There was no need to think about those unpleasant things anymore. After that, the two practiced some martial arts and went out to buy her dowry. At the same time, Zhouing was also thinking about what kind of dowry to prepare. In King Kang's imperial residence, his expression turned grave when he considered what happened to King Hui. He knew that the emperor supervised this matter, so it seemed that he had to be more careful in the future. Otherwise, he would also land in a terrible position. Yang Shiqing was beheaded 3 days later, and all his family members were exiled. Like the Gu family, the Bai family was raided and sent back to their hometown. Gu Wanning could not help but laugh. It would be impossible for Yang Wanyu to stand out now. At the same time, to relinquish the vengeance inside her, she brought Chuanxi over to take a look from afar. When she saw Yang Wanyu's miserable appearance with handcuffs and shackles on her body, she could not help but smile. She realized that only Yang Wanyu and her brother had no one sending them off or giving them clothes. She said happily to Chuanxi, let's go home and buy some meat. We'll have a good celebration tonight. Oh, mistress, you aren't going to send them off? No need. It's enough to see her in a sorry state. Gu Wanning shook her head. As for sending them off, she would just be mocking her. There was really no need for that. If word got out, it would be detrimental to her reputation. When Chuanxi heard this, She quickly walked back with her. In the blink of an eye, more than half a month had passed. It was also the day of King Kang's daughter's 1-month-old birthday. The night before, King Kong walked in and said, "Imperial Father has decided on the naming convention for the next generation of girls. It would start with Lu." Mother gave the child the word Xin, which meant prosperity. From now on, she will be called Yang Lixin. Lixin, a lovely name with a good meaning. Zhou Jiaying said, "Your Highness, no matter what, our daughter is the first child of her generation. Shouldn't the emperor bequeath her a title or something? Who would be given a title at birth? Moreover, she was not his legitimate daughter. It was already good enough that the emperor remembered that there was such a person." Of course, he only said this inwardly and not out loud. Why not? Isn't Mingyu one of them? Moreover, she's not even the emperor's flesh and blood. King Kong turned around and said with disdain, "Your ambition is inflating. Remember that I was only conferred the title of king last year. As for Mingyu, she's a special case. Back then, when King followed Imperial Father out of the palace, he helped block an arrow and almost lost his life. After Consort received the news, she gave birth prematurely and almost died with the baby. That was why Mingyu was given the title of princess. Do you think anyone can start at the top without any contributions?" Zhou Jiaying felt her heart beating fast under his gaze. She hugged his arm and replied coquettishly, "I want to fight more for my daughter. Since it's impossible, then I won't suggest it again in the future. It's good that you remember. Mother will be here tomorrow, so be careful when you speak. If you make her unhappy, neither you nor your daughter will have a good time." After King Kong finished speaking, he pulled his arm out and walked out. "Farewell, Your Highness." Zhou Jiaying bowed immediately. After he walked far away, she looked at Mrs. Yu with an aggrieved expression and asked, "Mrs. Yu, do you think His Highness has a change of heart?" Chapter 578 Reflection. This servant can't be sure either. It's possible that he's angry because of what you said before. At this point, Mrs. Yu hesitated and added, "Madam, I feel that you should try your best to serve His Highness and make him happy. As long as he's happy, there are many things that you don't need to ask for. In order to please you, he will give them to you. On the other hand, taking the initiative to ask would be counterproductive." Although Zhou Jiaying felt uncomfortable, she knew what she said made sense. Initially, she thought their relationship would never change, but over the past few months, she realized that he had changed. He had changed so much that she felt she was no different from any other woman to him. It seemed that she really had to reflect on herself. She could not imagine how they would live the rest of their lives if she lost favor. She said, "Mrs. Yu, prepare my bath. Prepare the clothes and accessories that I will wear tomorrow." "Yes, but your body is still weak. You must be careful not to hurt your body." "Understood. Go and prepare." On the day of Yang Lexin's full moon, the Gu residence was invited because they had sold the greenhouse vegetables to King Kong. Zhouing had no choice but to bring Gu Wanning to King Kang's residence. After registering the 100 taels as their gift, they took the initiative to drink tea in a corner. Then, the royal family members began to arrive one after another. At this moment, Zhouing also discovered that King Kong had mainly invited royal family members. As for the ministers in the court, they were either relatives of the Marquis of Dingon or first-grade officials like Prime Minister Su or Grand Scholar Sunday. She was probably the only one of her kind who did not have an imperial mandate. When she saw this, she could not help but be on alert. Soon, Mrs. Sun sat down and said, "You must be Mrs. Gu. Madam Sun sure has a good memory. I didn't expect that you would still recognize a commoner after only meeting once. It's mainly because you're too beautiful. It's hard not to remember you." "I'll take it as a compliment." Mrs. Sun was stunned for a moment and smiled. "It is a compliment. I heard that Lord Gus Greenhouse has begun to produce vegetables. Is that true?" "Yes, but there are only leafy vegetables now. They will appear at the banquet later." "That's great. I wonder if you can send some to my residence. I haven't eaten fresh vegetables in a long time. No problem, but the quantity is limited. I'm afraid I can only let you have a taste. Just send as many as you can. Mrs. Sun nodded. At this moment, Consort walked over. Madam Sun immediately stood up and went to chat with Gu Wanning. What surprised Zhou Ying was that Consort also mentioned sending vegetables. Don't you also grow vegetables in your hot spring manor? Zhou Ying asked in confusion. How much can we plant? Besides, there are many owners of that manor. We barely get a share of the produce. That's true, but there's a limit to what's grown in the greenhouse too. I'm afraid we can't give too many. I understand. Please send over as many as you can. Following that, many more came asking for vegetables. Zhou Ying finally understood what Zhou Huaiming meant. As long as the news was released, the vegetables would sell like hotcakes. However, she replied to all of them with the same thing and did not dare boast about her produce. Conversely, Mrs. Sun chatted with Gu Wanning for a while. Seeing that she had a gentle personality and did not like to gossip too much, she finally heaved a sigh of relief. After all, the Gu couple were very close to King Rue. Now that Gu Wanning had changed her surname, she could be considered a real member of the Gu family. If she had a stubborn personality, her daughter would not have an easy time in the future. Chapter 579 Jealous Soon. Sun Miaoka also arrived. Mrs. Sun exchanged a few more polite words with Gu Wanning before going to look for her daughter. After a while, Zhou Jiaying came in with her daughter in her arms. Mrs. Yu, Mother Zhou, and Zhou Jiaqing followed behind. When everyone saw that the baby had arrived, they immediately went forward and gave their small gifts. When it was Zhou Ying's turn, she took out a small gold bracelet engraved with the word fortune and handed it to Mrs. Yu. I hope Miss Lachine will be blessed in the future. Thank you. Zhou Jiaying laughed. After that, she took a serious look at Zhou Ying. Although Zhou Ying was dressed in the simplest clothes, she found her skin fair and supple. Her hair was black and luscious, indicating that she was living a very comfortable life. Zhou Ying's eyes were clear, revealing tenacity and guile. She looked completely different from the Zhou Ying back then. It was no wonder Zhou Jiaqing had no advantage in her hands. At the same time, a sense of jealousy rose in her heart. Her status was clearly higher than Zhou Ying's, and she was married into a better family. Yet, her life was not as comfortable as Zhou Ying's. At this time, Zhou Jiaying's mother and Zhou Jiaqing, who were helping Zhou Jiaying greet the others, also returned. Zhou Ying smiled and nodded at Mother Zhou, then turned around and left. Zhou Jiaqing wanted to chase after her, but Mother Zhou stopped her. Zhou Ying was no longer the same person she was. Moreover, since the old madam had already clarified that they no longer had any relationship with each other, there was no need for them to find trouble. Although Zhou Jiaqing was indignant, she didn't say anything else. Soon, Consort Shu arrived, and everyone hurriedly stood up and bowed. Everyone, get up. After Consort Shu finished speaking, she turned around and hugged young Lachine, saying, "Ah, our little darling is awake. Look at those big, watery eyes. They're so beautiful." "Indeed, this child's eyes are like yours." Zhou Jiaying laughed. "Oh, please." Consort Shu smiled. "It's the truth. Your eyes are publicly recognized as the most beautiful of all." Zhou Jiaying added, "This child's face is similar to Jiaying's. She has a pair of dimples on her small oval face and looks so cute when she smiles." Mrs. Su stepped forward with a smile. When everyone heard this, they surrounded the child and praised her. Zhou Ying saw this and quickly went to the side to continue drinking her tea. In the afternoon, after everyone had left, Zhou Jiaqing looked at Mother Zhou and asked, "Mom, Zhou Ying was so arrogant before. Why didn't you let me teach her a lesson? You're just too impulsive when you've suffered before." Besides, Your grandmother has already helped us draw a clear line with her, so don't provoke her. Otherwise, when something happens, the ones who will lose face will be us. Indeed, you really have to change your personality. Besides, quarrels can't solve our problems, and you are only making yourself more angry. Zhou Jiaying nodded in agreement. Moreover, she had already found the best way to vent her anger. She would destroy Zhou Ying's happy life when the time was right. You should learn more from your sister. Otherwise, when you get married in the future, you'll suffer. Mother Zhou chided her. You guys. I'm going to see Lixin. Seeing that none of them took her seriously, Zhou Jiaqing snorted in dissatisfaction and ran out. Zhou Jiaying shook her head and asked, Mother, is there any progress on her marriage? Why don't we just find a stable, honest, wealthy family for her? With her personality, she won't have a good life in the future if it isn't a family we can suppress. She might even bring trouble to our family. Chapter 580 Royal Families Banquet 1. Your father had the same idea. He said he has a subordinate who runs a pharmacy and comes from a good family. He wanted to discuss this matter once his subordinate came to the capital to deliver medicine in the spring. Mother Zhou then asked, by the way, how are things on your side? His Highness doesn't mind that the baby is a daughter, right? Not really. That's good. Your mother has lived most of her life understanding one thing. Fighting for favor isn't to suppress other women, but to keep a man's heart. As long as his heart is still with you, you don't have to be afraid of anything. In the future, you should pay more attention to him, go along with him more, and give in sometimes. Don't blindly compete and win over others, or else you'll lose his heart like your mother. I will remember it. Zhou Jiaying nodded. After that, the mother and daughter chatted more before Mother Zhou brought Zhou Jiaqing home. In the evening, Zhouing told Gu Chengrui about the orders by the various families and asked, how are things on your side? If you don't have enough to sell to all of them, I can take some out of inner space to make up for it. Don't. I will harvest as much as I can. I will just send less to each family, or else if our harvest doesn't match, the people in the manor will be suspicious. But I won't bring any vegetables back to our residence. If you want to eat some, you need to tell me in advance, and I'll bring some over before shipping everything away. All right, hurry up and send them over. We can still plan another batch before the new year. Yeah, Gu Chengrui nodded. For the next 2 days, Gu Chengrui delivered vegetables to the various residences, including the Imperial Palace, and planted another batch of vegetables. Zhouing continued teaching Gu wanting martial arts and helped her prepare her dowry. She would head to her manor, or Yang Qinglin's manor when bored. She requested they keep some livestock cubs, especially pigs, in preparation for next year. In the blink of an eye, it was the end of the year, and they sold yet another batch of leafy vegetables. At the same time, Sun Hongliang sent someone to deliver a pig, 2 sheep, and a cow through King Rui's men. Zhouing asked Lin Yitian to send half a pig to their manor after receiving the livestock. After Gu Chengrui found out that Zhou Huaiming had returned to the capital, he invited him to spend the new year at his house every day except for the eve of the new year. As a result, Zhou Huaiming gained more than 10 pounds in half a month. On the 15th, at the Imperial Family's Lantern Festival banquet, everyone was surprised to see him all fattened. King Rui patted his shoulder and said, Cousin, if you continue to eat like this, be careful that you won't even be able to hold your sword in the future. Speaking of which, it's all Miss Zhou's fault. If it weren't for the fact that her cooking is so delicious, I wouldn't have stuffed myself full every time. Humble brag. Hee, I really can't help it. It's too delicious. Zhou Huaiming said with an awkward smile before turning serious. Oh right, I heard that the scale of this banquet is large. Even officials from other places who came to the capital to take the examination have been invited. Is the emperor planning something huge? Not really. I heard that the main purpose of this banquet is to treat everyone to a meal and discuss this year's plans, especially the promotion of sweet potatoes and greenhouses. Are you referring to the greenhouse vegetables? I heard that Gu Chungrui delivered half of the harvest to the palace. Yes, no matter what, the successful planting of greenhouse vegetables has solved the problem of eating vegetables in winter in the north. It's worth promoting to great lengths. Great to hear. Zhou Huaiming let out a sigh of relief. Let's go. Follow me to the Emperor's study to report this year's deployment. After saying that, King Rui walked straight to the study. Zhou Huaiming immediately followed after him. Zhou brought Gu Wanning into the palace, and she headed to visit the Empress Dowager. Because there were too many people, she only exchanged a few polite greetings before following Princess Mingyu to the side hall. Chapter 581 Royal Family's Banquet 2. As soon as the three of them entered, a white-haired old woman said in a strange tone, "Hey, isn't this the second daughter of the Zhou family, Zhou Ying? I heard that she fell out with her family the moment she returned to the capital. No matter what, the Zhou family raised you. You can't just ignore your family when your wings harden." Zhou Ying turned her head to look at her after hearing that. She then ignored her after she noticed who it was. It was the Empress' second aunt, the great-aunt of the Liu family. Previously, because the Liu family had previously helped Prince Hui in his assassination attempt on Prince Rui, they had been grounded for 3 months. Zhou Ying didn't expect them to be out so soon. However, looking at the murderous aura on her body, she must have killed many people. Seeing that she was ignoring her, Madame Liu immediately demanded angrily, "What? You don't even know how to respect the old and love the young? Are you worthy of that?" Zhou Ying said with a cold glance. What? Am already respecting you by ignoring you. Don't forget why you were grounded by the Emperor. Do you need me to help you spread the news?" Madame Liu was so angry that she trembled and pointed at her, but could not say a word. Mingyu looked at the two of them and quickly said, "Let's go somewhere else." After saying that, she pulled them to the other side halls. "Tell me, do you still respect your elders? You are simply too condescending." Madame Liu pointed at their backs and shouted. However, everyone just casually responded with a few grunts to give the Empress face before ignoring her. After all, even the Zhou family did not care about Zhou Ying's situation. What grounds do they have to stick their hands into this? Besides, they wanted to buy more vegetables from the Gu family. If they offended Zhou Ying, where else would they get their vegetables? Seeing this, Madame Liu was embarrassed and immediately stood up to leave. The moment she left, everyone started gossiping. Some said she used to bully others, while others began digging into her past and describing how she had stepped over corpses to rise from a concubine to her husband's official wife. Madame Liu, who was listening outside the halls, was so angry that she almost vomited blood. She quickly went to look for the Empress and her sister-in-law. On the other end, after Zhou Ying and the others left, they did not go to the other side halls. Instead, they went outside to look at the lanterns. Although the sky was not dark, the colorful lanterns were still attractive. "Wow, that little white rabbit is so beautiful." Mingyu pointed at a lantern hanging on a plum blossom tree. "Yeah, it's very cute. It looks like she's stealing food." Gu Wanning echoed. Zhou Ying stepped forward and took a good look, admiring these crafts, especially the picture painted on them. With just a few simple strokes, these craftsmen had drawn a cute little rabbit on a delicate lantern. She asked, "Will there be more lanterns on the street outside tonight?" "I'm not too sure about that. Because of the disaster, there hasn't been a lantern festival for 2 years." "Oh, right. I heard that Qingshui Town in Yunhe County had a fireworks festival. Is that true?" Mingyu asked. "Yeah, I saw it once on the second day after I went back. It was very beautiful, but there was a sea of people at the festival. It was a pity that the fireworks were short-lived, unlike a lantern that could leave something behind." Zhou Ying then gave them a detailed description of the festival. "Wow, it sounds beautiful and shocking. We'll go and take a look when the year is better," Mingyu said excitedly. "You're making me want to go too." Gu Wanning echoed. "If there's a chance in the future, they'll treat you guys to a big meal and watch fireworks." "Yo, What are you girls talking about so happily? At this moment, a curious voice came from not far away. Chapter 582 Royal Family's Banquet 3. Zhou Ying turned around and frowned when she saw Consort Shu, Zhou Jiaying, and Zhou Jiaqing. However, the three of them still quickly stepped forward and bowed. Greetings, Consort Shu. Zhou Ying and Gu Wanting also greeted Zhou Jiaying. Do get up. What were you guys talking about just now? Consort Shu helped them up and asked with a smile. It's nothing much. We were mainly talking about the rabbit lantern and then about the fireworks in Sister Zhou's hometown. Mingyu replied, I've heard King Kong mention the fireworks over there before. They're indeed one of a kind. Consort Shu nodded. I heard that Mingyu has already started training female soldiers. How are the results? It's still too short for results, and they are still practicing the horse stance. I'm afraid it'll take a year and a half to see any effect. That's true. Sorry, I was just too impatient. Consort Shu nodded and asked Zhou Ying, I heard that the greenhouse was successful. I wonder what vegetables are being harvested this time? Well, other than the leafy vegetables we harvested previously, there are also cucumbers, beans, tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, pumpkins, carrots, and so on. Good. There are both thick and thin vegetables. Looks like we're going to have a good meal tonight. Zhou Ying smiled and did not reply. You guys go ahead and stroll around. Shall we go and see the other lanterns? Mingyu asked. Go ahead. There's a lotus lantern over there that's very well made. You can go over and take a look. After Consort Shu finished speaking, she pointed to the left. Thank you for your guidance, Consort Shu. After Mingyu finished speaking, she immediately led the two of them away. After they left, Consort Shu turned her head to look at Zhou Ying's back and said with a smile, I didn't expect that pitiful girl back then would turn out this well. Pingyang sure has a good eye. The two sisters felt uncomfortable after hearing this. What did Consort Shu mean by pitiful? Was she implying that the Zhou family abused Zhou Ying? If it weren't for her status, Zhou Jiaying would have retorted. Zhou Jiaqing muttered indignantly, What's the use of a concubine's daughter who has no one to rely on, no matter how good she looks? Consort Shu glanced at her after hearing this and was too lazy to pay attention to her. She turned her head to look at Zhou Jiaying. Seeing that she was submissive and didn't show any dissatisfaction, Consort Shu nodded. No matter what Zhou Jiaying was thinking, it was fine as long as she did not show it or embarrass her son. She stood up and was about to leave when a few girls walked over and bowed. Greetings, Consort Shu. When Consort Shu saw the leading Hong Suji, she immediately smiled and said, Hurry up and rise. Since we've met, let's take a walk together.
Yes.
Hong Suji responded and followed. Consort Shu looked at her and asked, When did you enter the palace? Is your mother here? We just arrived not long ago. Mother is still at the Empress Dowager's place. We wanted to pay you a visit, and we didn't expect to meet you here. This is fate. Consort Shu smiled. Then, they chatted and laughed, completely isolating the Zhou sisters. Hong Suzi's sisters also took the opportunity to squeeze the two sisters to the sidelines gradually. But Zhou Jiaying didn't dare to say anything. Seeing this, Zhou Jiaqing was indignant and ran off to look for her friends. Zhou Jiaying gritted her teeth in anger when she saw her adding insult to injury. She could only step forward and say, Imperial Mother, it's been quite a while since we've come out. I have to go and take a look at the child, so please go without me. She hoped Consort Shu would give her some face for the sake of her child. Unexpectedly, Consort Shu waved her hand and said, Go. The child is still young. Don't let her catch a cold. Chapter 583 Royal Family's Banquet 4. Yes. Zhou Jiaying turned around and left. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. Before, she could have been the main consort, but because of Consort Shu's dissuasion, His Highness made her the secondary consort. All these years, she has always been respectful to her. She was just short of clinging to her daily, yet Consort Shu harbored no sincerity in her respect. On the other hand, Consort Shu was beaming with joy the moment Hong Suji arrived. Was it because her father was not as influential as the Hong family? Or did she look down on her from the very beginning? She got really angry when she thought of this. When she thought of His Highness' cold attitude toward her, the anger in her heart rose further. It seemed that she had been too obedient to them in the past. It was time to let them see the capabilities of the Zhou family. Thinking of this, she returned to look at her child. Seeing that her daughter was already asleep, she sent someone to send the baby back and then went to look for her mother. After Zhou and her group walked around for a while, they encountered a large group of officials in official uniforms surrounding Gu Chungrue and saying something. However, those officials were all unfamiliar faces. Zhou turned to look at Mingyu and asked, "Mingyu, where did those officials come from? If I'm not wrong, they are from the northern regions here for the sweet potatoes, new wheat seeds, and greenhouse vegetables. Haven't the sweet potatoes and wheat been promoted to them? The country is so big, so how can a small amount of seeds cover the entire country? My father told me that sweet potatoes are mostly distributed in mountainous and sandy areas. For those with good land, wheat was given. They were allowed to stay in the capital this time to give them options to support each other." Zhou listened to the Mingyu points and nodded. She suddenly thought of Gu Zi, who got her position snatched by the daughter of Magistrate Zhao and almost killed her. Would Magistrate Zhao be here this time? After that, the three strolled and went straight to the banquet venue. This banquet wasn't set in the imperial court. Instead, they set up a large tent outside the imperial court in a large open space. After entering, they found a table for the Gu residents and sat down. When Zhou saw there was tea, she asked the palace maid to bring a pot. She then poured a cup of tea for each of them. After taking a sip of tea, she glanced at the 4 rows of long and dense seats and said, "It seems that the scale of this banquet is very large. Yeah, all officials above the 5th rank in the capital, including all officials all over the country, must participate." Mingyu nodded. She added, "Oh, haha, if you are selling your vegetables again, Sister Zhou, remember to leave some for our King N's imperial residence." What are you saying? When have we ever not remembered King N's imperial residence? I knew Sister Zhou always treated me the best. A princess calling a woman without an imperial mandate her sister? Aren't you afraid of ruining seniority? The 8th princess walked in with a group of people and retorted, "This princess status is not high enough, so there's no need to suck up to others." After Mingyu finished speaking, she glanced at the crowd behind the 8th princess and said, "I suggest that you carefully identify the people around you and consider your friends seriously." You're just jealous that I have so many friends." After the 8th princess finished speaking, she brought her sisters to sit around her. She has no distinction between good and bad friends. Mingyu shook her head and ignored her. Zhou smiled when she saw this. "It's fine, as long as we did our part." "That's true. Anyway, the two of us don't really care about each other." Mingyu nodded in agreement. "By the way, Wanning," she said to Gu Wanning, "how's the preparation of your dowry going? Is there anything I can help you with?" Chapter 584 Royal Families Banquet 5. Not at the moment. Zhou has already helped me prepare most of what I need. If there is anything else, I will look for you again. All right, don't stand on ceremony. As the 3 of them chatted, many more guests walked in one after another. However, most of them were women and young ladies, and there were also some young boys. Soon, more than half of the tent was occupied, and the chattering almost sounded like a market. Zhou curiously spread out her divine senses to look and found that most of them were matchmaking for their children, especially the madams who weren't from the capital. They were all trying their best to promote their children for engagement. Many people even enjoyed watching this. At this moment, Zhouing thought of something. She looked at Mingyu and asked, Mingyu, how old are you this year? Mingyu, who was drinking tea, was surprised by the sudden question. I'm 17 after the day of the Lunar New Year. What's wrong? 17? Why didn't consort and get you ready for your marriage? My marriage has to be approved by the emperor, but since the emperor has not mentioned it, my father did not dare to ask. He has to ask soon. If you delay any longer, all the good men of your age will be snatched away. It will be difficult to find a suitable one by then. Gu Waning's heart skipped a beat when she heard that. She immediately remembered Mingyu's miserable ending in her previous life. Even though the sudden change in King Rui had changed the political situation in this life, who knew if the emperor would still use Mingyu for a marriage alliance? Thinking of this, she nodded in agreement and said, Indeed, the emperor is always busy, and he's also a man. Perhaps he didn't take this matter to heart. You and your father should choose a few candidates and report to the emperor. If it's suitable, he will definitely agree to your marriage. Mingyu blushed and nodded. 111 Mention it to my mother later. I think you should mention it to your grandmother too. Zhouing added. No matter what, the Empress Dowager and Madame Consort and were friends. It was safer for her to come forward compared to Consort, and Mingyu understood what Zhouing meant. She nodded and said, I understand. Seeing this, Zhouing did not say anything more. She simply poured another cup of tea and drank it. A moment later, a mother and daughter walked over and bowed. Greetings, Princess Mingyu. Mingyu glanced at them. After confirming that they did not know each other, she raised her head and replied, Do raise your heads. There's no need to be so polite. Thank you, Princess. After the two of them got up, the woman looked at Zhouing and asked, Are you Mrs. Gu? You are. I'm the wife of Lord Zhao of the Kaiyang Prefecture. This is my daughter, Zhao Shili. The woman introduced herself. Zhouing looked at them in surprise. Although they had never met before, they were technically considered enemies. For a moment, she could not figure out why they had come. What's the matter? She asked directly. Madame Zhao looked at her vigilant gaze and smiled awkwardly. I know because of Xiaoying, we. Zhouing directly interrupted her. Just say what you're here for. Madame Zhao did not speak, but looked at Mingyu and Gu Waning. Mingyu looked at Zhouing. Zhouing hesitated for a moment and nodded. She wanted to see what the mother and daughter wanted from her. Let's go, Waning. Accompany me to the toilet. Gu Waning grabbed Zhou hand. Noticing that Zhouing had just squeezed back, she got up and walked out. Only then did Zhouing invite the mother and daughter to sit down. If you have something to say it now. After Madame Zhao sat down, she tilted her head and whispered, I want to work with you and your husband to take down Zhao. Chapter 585 Royal Family's Banquet 6. Zhouing looked at her in shock and asked, Do you know that no matter what happens, you and your children will be implicated? I know. Then why are you? I'm not afraid that you'll laugh at me. I couldn't win against that vixen, Zhao Xiaoying. My son's legs were crippled before the new year, and now he's completely disabled. Madame Zhao looked at Zhao Shili with tears in her eyes. He now wants to send my daughter to the palace to pave the way for him and his son-in-law. Zhouing was stunned for a moment. Isn't this a good thing? After entering the palace, it's a matter of whether your daughter wants to help or not. Could it be that he dares ask the emperor for her? But there's the empress. I can't let my daughter put herself in danger. Madame Zhao hesitated. When Zhouing heard that, she remembered that Zhou Huaiming mentioned that Lord Zhao was the first prince's subordinate. However, didn't these people have other connections through their marriage? She asked curiously, What about your maternal family? You can ask them for help. My family is already down and out. The only cousin who can support me is gone, so... Your cousin is... Lord Bai from the Ministry of Works. Zhouing was stunned after hearing this. What a coincidence. The emperor will be here in a while. Isn't it more convenient for you to directly complain to him? There's no need to come to collaborate with us, right? My son is still in his hands. Why do you think I would help you? Don't mention my cousin-in-law. She's doing very well now. To be honest, we should thank Zhao Xiaoying. My cousin's life wouldn't be so comfortable if it weren't for. Don't you hate Zhao Xiaoying? Madame Zhao looked at her in surprise. Xiaoying shook her head and said, I don't hate her. She and her husband are just scumbags. If he doesn't want my cousin-in-law as his wife, so be it. What if they plan to plot against you and your wife? What do you mean? We'll let you know if you agree to collaborate. No, we'll deal with whatever comes our way. We're not afraid of them. You. Think about it carefully. After tonight, my offer will be invalid. Madame Zhao stood up and left with her daughter. Zhouing saw this and followed Madame Zhao with her divine senses. She found that in addition to the thick black fog on Madame Zhao's body, indicating bad luck, a bloody aura also shrouded her. This meant that Madame Zhao had killed someone before. However, thinking about it, it made sense. How could she be someone kind if she dared find an enemy to plot against her husband? As for Madame Zhao's daughter, there was nothing on her other than bad luck. However, her unreconciled and vicious face indirectly showed that she was not a kind person either. When they arrived outside and found a remote place, Zhouing heard Miss Zhao ask in panic, Mother, what should we do? She won't help us. If it really doesn't work, we can only go all out and report him. No, Mother, we will lose our lives. Fine, let's die together. The three of us can't become their stepping stones. Otherwise, I want die in peace. But Madame Zhao tidied her daughter's clothes and said, if it really doesn't work out, you must change your appearance and escape. Mother has had enough of these aggrieved days. Mother, all right, take advantage of the fact that they are not watching us now. Hurry up and leave the palace, or else it will be too late. But go. If possible, remember to go back and bring your brother out. After Madame Zhao finished speaking, she gave her a roll of banknotes. Chapter 586 Royal Family's Banquet 7. Miss Zhao hesitated for a moment, but still took the money. The mother and daughter knocked out a palace maid resembling Miss Zhao. Miss Zhao quickly changed into the palace maid's clothes and ran toward another palace. When Madame Zhao returned, she saw two nannies in a hurry from afar. She panicked and immediately quickened her pace, but she was quickly stopped by a young eunuch who handed her over to two nannies. One of the older nannies asked directly, Where's Miss Zhao? She went to relieve herself. Madame Zhao replied expressionlessly, Liar. After the old nanny finished speaking, she pushed her toward the young nanny and said, Take her away and lock her up. The young nanny nodded and took out a dagger. While holding on to Madame Zhao, she pressed against her lower back with the dagger. Meanwhile, the elderly nanny brought the young eunuch and a few palace maids to look for Miss Zhao. When they found the clothes Miss Zhao had left behind and the fainted palace maid, the others continued searching while the young eunuch hurriedly ran to the Empress. Zhouing was a little confused when she saw this. What did Madame Zhao know that could make the Empress so wary of her? And that Miss Zhao, was she really meant to be a palace maid? Zhouing refused to believe it. Thinking of this, she began to scan Madame Zhao. She must have evidence of something since she wanted to report to the Emperor. Otherwise, how else would she plead for help? Sure enough, there was a small pocket sewn on the inside of Madame Zhao's undergarment. There was a folded piece of paper inside. She immediately stored it in her interspace. Otherwise, it would definitely be destroyed if it were discovered. Zhouing took the opportunity to go to the toilet and entered her interspace. She quickly browsed through the evidence that Madame Zhao had written. She did not expect that this was evidence of Lord Zhao helping the first prince with various corruptions and crimes. One of the things that shocked her the most was killing officials with exemplary political achievements and then replacing them with someone else, just like Lord Sunday. Lord Zhao's residence was basically filled with the first prince's people. No wonder the servants of the Zhao residence dared to be so arrogant. There were also some cases of corruption, and seizing the property of those who refused to collaborate. This was simply appalling. No, she couldn't let Madame Zhao die. Otherwise, it would be challenging to prove many of their crimes. Thinking of this, Zhou immediately left the room and found Madame Zhao through her divine sense. She was imprisoned in a storeroom, which was filled with porcelain ornaments. Knowing Madame Zhao was not in danger for the time being, Zhou went to look for Miss Zhao. Miss Zhao got lucky. She found a set of clothes that looked old and torn. After wearing it, she seemed to have aged by more than 10 years. Miss Zhao was now heading into a tunnel. As for where it led to, Zhou couldn't tell as it was dark and long inside. However, it was enough to know that she was fine. As Zhou walked back, she looked at the emperor. He was currently with Gu Chungrui, emphasizing how to spread the new farming methods to the officials outside quickly. While the emperor was drinking tea, Zhou used the voice of Mother God to send a message to him. The emperor was stunned. When he remembered the 2 times Mother God had entered his dream, his hands couldn't help but tremble, and he almost spilled the tea in his hands. He got up and said, "You guys continue discussing. They'll be back soon." After saying that, he called Eunuch Li to the side hall and asked him to guard the entrance. The emperor knelt and whispered, "Mother God, what advice do you have?" Zhou didn't reply. Instead, she just sent the piece of paper over through her inner space. The emperor saw the paper heart floating in his hand and opened it to read. The more he read, the more ashen his face became. In the end, he angrily punched the ground. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.